Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in Washington, D.C., and we are going to be talking about the outlook for the 2017 and 2018 budget with Kate Blakeley, who is the defense budget person here at CSBA. Kate, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Vago.
So let's start out, 2017. There's all of this great budgetary enthusiasm in Washington, right? There are folks who are looking at the McCain plan and saying, wow, that's going to be really a tremendous amount of money. There are some folks who are saying, well, John is trying to set the ceiling, as some people look at it. Some people are saying, wow, the spending could be even larger than that $430 billion 5-year plan that they suggested in terms of a base budget increase. As you look at the budget, what's the most reasonable numbers that folks should be expecting, not just in 17, but in 18 as well as in the out years?
Sure. I mean, John McCain is certainly trying to anchor a conversation about the fiscal 18 fit-up. $640 billion in base budget is a large number. That's even $8 billion higher than the Gates budget back in 2012, much vaunted as the pre-sequester budget. I don't think you're going to get nearly that close. I think something more likely would be in the about $50 billion at a maximum over the PP17.
So, and you're looking at $50 billion just in that 1 year as the maximum increase. And does that include, and that's only in the base budget. So do you expect also any growth in the OCO, or do you expect some contraction in OCO as a consequence?
I expect OCO to remain about flat. It's acknowledged there's about $41 billion worth of base budget expenditures in OCO. That and the actual operational expenses gives you that they're $18 billion. And without a repeal of the BCA, which is still rather up in the air, you're not going to see an ability to move those expenses back into the base budget.
Still, that would be a remarkable amount of money. And there are still, and I'm sorry I misspoke earlier in terms of the top line figure. I had another number in my head. But there are those folks who say that even $50 billion could be a very, very optimistic number. If you look at, South Carolina Republican Mick Mulvaney is going to be the budget director, or expected to be the budget director. Obviously, he's got a little bit of a nanny issue, but there are those who say that, they don't see that as a potential deal breaker. He is the fiscal hawk of fiscal hawks. I mean, this is the guy who, on budget principle alone, stopped Sandy aid and was one of the folks who actually precipitated the Budget Control Act. How likely is it that this fiscal hawk, especially at a time when the Republicans are looking at large infrastructure spending, tax cuts are spending by other means, that they don't really necessarily want to increase the deficit that much more by just adding this much to the defense budget? Do you think that that's going to be a factor at all?
Sure. I mean, one thing to keep in mind with the nomination of Rep. Mulvaney to the position of OMB director is this a way that the fiscal hawks in Congress are advancing their agenda within the administration, or is this a way that the administration can neuter or counteract some of the strength of the fiscal hawks in the House? You'll notice that in the House budget resolution, you increase the deficit by, I think, $9 trillion, and there hasn't really been a lot of debate in the House Freedom Caucus about that number because it's now considered an acceptable price to advance your other policy goals.
Where do you see the prospects for ditching the Budget Control Act ultimately then?
At this point, I give it about a 50-50 chance. I think it really depends on how the legislative vehicles come together. Of course, if it's through a budget reconciliation, you only need to keep 50 of the Republicans to keep the BCA caps and to repeal the BCA caps and enable them to basically vanish into the mist. Whether or not they go that route is still too early to say.
Do you think Democrats go along with it? Because Democrats have historically said, if you're going to get any top-line increase in defense, you're going to have to give us a top-line increase in discretionary government-wide spending.
I think the Democrats, particularly the Senate Democrats, are going to fight it as much as they can. You remember this year and last year in the House, in the Defense Authorization and Appropriations Bill, there was a very strong reluctance to let defense spending have a blank check without the corresponding increase for non-defense spending. There's no reason now that they would change their policy position. Unfortunately, the political position has changed a lot for them. They don't have a veto threat from the White House, and particularly if the Republicans pursue the budget reconciliation maneuver, it's not clear how much legislative leverage they would actually have.
Do you think, how many years of sustained spending do you think there will be? Or does this become a situation where after a few short years, deficit increases and rates of borrowing, which have been going up, right, Paul Krugman, you and I were talking about the article that Krugman wrote, which is a couple of years ago when the rates of borrowing were nearly zero, you could actually afford to increase your debt. That wasn't necessarily that big of a problem. But now that these borrowing rates are going up, 1.5%, on mortgage, for example, rates going up over the last couple of months, how does that change potentially the strategic budget dynamic? Because even very minuscule increases in the borrowing rate cause giant payment increases on the part of the government.
Sure, and the increase in interest rates definitely has a lot to do with the constraints, but it's a three-legged stool. You have your revenues, you have your deficits, and you have your spending. And to look at one of them in isolation, you can't really do that. If you have a willingness to increase revenues, which may or may not happen with a revamping of the tax code, that gives you a little bit more room in terms of spending. That also gives you room in terms of gradually building down the deficit, as happened during the Clinton years.
Do you see a big drive for entitlements reform, which is something that, everybody has said, no matter how far back you went, whether or not you were talking to Boehner or Pelosi or anybody else, they were like, look, we all have to hold hands and kind of jump off the bridge. Nobody wanted to jump off the bridge at that point. The grand bargain fell apart, and obviously that's all a matter of history. But how likely do you think it is for folks that try to take a holistic view of this ultimately in order to sort of, rip the Band-Aid off, if you will?
Sure, and entitlement reform is not necessarily the same thing as entitlement cuts. And if you increase the payroll tax cap on Social Security, for example, you push back the depletion date of the trust fund by a lot. The question is whether that's politically palpable for the Republicans. I think Paul Ryan is definitely testing the waters as to how much the voters will accept cuts to Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. That's something we also see a lot of daylight between him and the president-elect. President-elect Trump has said several times that he does not want to see any cuts to particularly Social Security and Medicare, but we'll see how that plays out politically in just a few weeks.
Do you think that the Affordable Care Act repeal or replace, Republicans have said that we're willing to tolerate $1 trillion increase, for example, in the debt to try to get rid of that. Do you think that that's realistic? Could the costs actually be higher ultimately to make some of these changes to the system?
I think right now you're seeing a real split and a hesitation by some of the more mainline Republicans. I would look at particularly the more moderate Senate Republicans like Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski, where there's this hesitation about going forward with an ACA Obamacare repeal without a real idea of what the replacement is going to be like. And you've seen a shift in the political conversation just in the last few weeks between repeal and we'll figure out a replacement maybe sometime down the line to we need to see what the replacement would look like before we can go forward. And that's something that's definitely going to depend on how the voters react and how vocal they are.
Kate, thanks very much for joining us.
Certainly. Thank you, Vago.